All right. So we are wrapping up our study on the seven promises of God. Now, after this study, we've taken a break for a little while. Uh, would you want to go back to and continue our study on authentic Christianity? All right. So we're going to try to wrap this thing up tonight on the seven promises of God. And we've kind of looked at, let me get this PowerPoint working.
Kristen said yes.
So far we've covered the first six. We've talked about storms always come. We talked about heed the warnings, be prepared, know where to find refuge, and the enemy comes in like a flood. Then last week we spent our time talking about point six, and God is over the flood. And hopefully each of these lessons have reinforced these promises of God for us. You know, he promises that troubles come and that we need to be prepared and we need to be ready for that. But scripture repeatedly tells us, promises us that when we're in the midst of the storm, we know where to turn, we know where to find our refuge, we know that the enemy comes in strong, but most importantly, hopefully we've learned that God is always on our side. He's always with us, always blessing us. Our success is totally in his hands. I mean, we can work hard, we can do our very best, but at the end of the day, whether we succeed or fail, it falls more into God's hands than ours. Now, tonight we're going to consider this seventh one, and that is life always comes back. And the major premise here is that no matter what we go through, no matter what hardship or struggle, life always comes back. It's in part to the fact that God is always with us and blessing us. But no matter what happens and no matter how bad it gets, life always comes back. And to illustrate that, I want to look at two really key moments in the Old Testament. Most of you probably remember Genesis 6 because that's where it first starts talking about the coming flood and man's sinfulness. But chapter 9 also kind of reinforces this idea for us that life always comes back. So let's go ahead and turn to, one second, let me get this here, chapter 6. And somebody read for us verses 1 and 2. Genesis 6, verses 1 and 2.
And it came to pass, the men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. As the sons of God saw the daughters of men, they were fair, and took them wives of all which they chose.
All right, so I wanted to kind of spend just a few moments here in Genesis 6, kind of building up to this point, because there's some questions that we can ask about these first two verses that, for lack of a better term, can cause us to scratch our head at times. But I think it's important because we're going to see the reasoning for the flood. We're going to see man do what man always does, and that is make things worse. Man is always kind of pushed away from God. In chapter 6 is where you really start seeing that solidify. People are beginning to multiply and they're beginning to spread out away from the general area of the garden. So they're starting to spread out, they're starting to multiply, but more importantly, they're starting to drift away from God. I mean, do you get what it says here? When it says, daughters are born to them, and the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose, it tells us something really profound. Even the godly line of Seth is beginning to turn away from God, to become worldly and immoral. And that's a pretty challenging idea, but it really kind of speaks to human nature in a sense, but also it helps